Greetings from Berkeley, California. It's my pleasure to be a moderator for this talk on Republicanism in Thailand by Professor Patrick Jory, with a response from Professor Lisandro Claudio. My name is Thiti Jamkajornkeait, a Ph.D. candidate in South and Southeast Asian Studies at UC Berkeley, and the head of the academic division of the US-based Association for Thai Democracy, or ATD. First of all, let me thank the Center for Southeast Asia Studies, particularly Professor Nancy Peluso, the center's chair, and Sarah Maxim, the center's vice chair, for agreeing to host this event out of solidarity. Let me say a few words about ATD, the main organizer of this event. Founded in October 2020 to mobilize international support for a peaceful democratic transition in Thailand, the Association for Thai Democracy is a group of Thai students and professionals living in the US who sympathize with the pro-democracy movement back in our home country, Thailand. If you're interested in our cause and projects, please consider visiting our website, which I will be posting in the chat box later. Without further ado, allow me to introduce our speaker, Professor Jory. Patrick Jory received his Ph.D. in Southeast Asian history at the Australian National University. He currently teaches Southeast Asian history at the University of Queensland, from which he is zooming. It is true that Professor Jory has published widely on issues in modern Thai history, from the relationship between Lisandro Chadok and Thai ideal of monarchy, to political history of Pattani in southern Thailand, and middle-class nationalism in Thai soap opera Bupphe Sanniwat. But what I find as Professor Jory's strong suit is in his unparalleled grasp of Thai historiography and Thai intellectual history, as evident in his several writings, including the paper on Thai republicanism that becomes the subject of today's talk. He just recently published a book entitled A History of Manners and Civility in Thailand with Cambridge University Press this year. Currently, he is president of the Association of Mainland Southeast Asia Scholars and co-host of the podcast New Books in Southeast Asian Studies. This talk is structured as the following. Professor Jory will give a lecture for 40 minutes, followed by Professor Claudio's response for 10 minutes. Then we open the floor up for Q&A until the event ends. During and after the talk, feel free to post your question or comments in the separate Q&A box. Please also specify your current affiliation in your post. Professor Jory, now the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Thiti. And I hope everyone can hear me. It's hard to know when you're on Zoom. But first, let me say what an honor it is for me to be invited here to give a talk at to the UC Berkeley Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I'd like to thank the center for the invitation, and in particular, Thiti Jamkajornkeait, who really, I think, was the force behind organising this seminar. Also, Sarah Maxim, Lisandro, Claudio, and all the team for their hard work to arrange this event. So my talk today really has a very simple takeaway. Everyone knows that Thailand has a very powerful monarchy. And anyone who's spent time in the country will know that there's a powerful royalist, I guess, sort of political culture that values very highly, deferential behavioural norms like prostration and other things, which really date from the time of the absolute monarchy and which have been abolished in most other countries. But what is much less well known is that Thailand has one of the oldest republican traditions in Southeast Asia. Now, when we think of republicanism in Southeast Asia, we tend to think especially of countries like Philippines, which, technically speaking, was the first Asian republic, even though it was short-lived, or Vietnam. I'm thinking here of the work of people like Peter Zinnerman and Chris Gosha. But in those cases, the main objectives of republicanism was a country free from colonial rule. But in the case of uncolonized Thailand, the primary target of Republican-minded thinkers and later politicians was Thailand's monarchy. Now, because official nationalism in Thailand has so successfully associated the monarchy with Thai national identity, for a long time, royalist governments have painted republicanism as something that is foreign to Thailand. But in reality, or my argument, is that republicanism is actually something very familiar to Thailand, very familiar to Thai people. So what I want to argue today, or talk about today, is this hidden history of republicanism in Thailand. So I'll highlight various expressions of republicanism at different periods of Thailand's history. Then I'll make some conclusions. I guess everyone's sort of waiting for that one. Some conclusions about the state of republicanism in Thailand today. But just to emphasize, the reason I want to cover this long period of almost 140 years, I'll say that again, 140 years, is to emphasize the fact that, by contrast to our normal thinking that about the power of royalism and royalist culture and the monarchy in Thailand, Thailand actually has very fertile soil for republican ideas. To start off with, some definitions. In this talk, I use both a broad definition of republicanism, here meaning attempts to limit the powers of the monarchy. Okay, so you might still have a monarchy, but its powers are very limited, as well as a narrower definition, meaning a political agenda to remove the monarchy altogether and replace it with a presidential system. Okay, so I'm talking about two definitions of republicanism there. So firstly, let me start off, if I can take you back to 1885. This is the period of high imperialism in Southeast Asia and the world. And coincidentally, this is also the period where we see the first official expression of the desire to limit the powers of the Thai monarchy. And it appears in a petition submitted by a group of princes. Okay, these are princes of the blood and royal officials who were attached to Siamese embassies in London and Paris in 1885. Now, I think you can look at this in a very idealistic way. I think there are also sort of sometimes self-interested reasons here, but nevertheless, we see an official statement of kind of republican ideas. As we know, it's a time of political crisis in the region. The British have just sort of finished the Anglo-Burmese War, the Third Anglo-Burmese War, abolished the monarchy, or in the process of doing so. And so Burma is now fully under British colonial control. And a similar thing is happening in neighbouring, in Vietnam, Indochina more generally. So this petition, which is submitted to the King Chulalongkorn, kind of gives a really good sort of overview of the current situation, the crisis facing Siam at that time, posed by the encroaching European powers. And that they reasoned that there was no real other alternative but to reform Thailand's system of government, unless in the view of these the petitioners, unless Siam's government was reformed, then Thailand would fall the same way as the Burmese and the Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian kingdoms had fallen to European colonial rule. So it was seen. So in this early period, yes, it's directed against safeguarding, preserving Siamese independence. So it's interesting. I don't have time to go into the details of the petition, but it's worth actually reading, because what you'll find there is a really sophisticated analysis of Thailand's position, or Siam's position at that time, and Southeast Asia generally, and also the world. These guys are they're global thinkers. Even back then, they've got a good idea of what's going on around the world. So they present a list of 7 demands. Firstly, that, I guess most importantly, that the system of government in the kingdom be transformed from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy, similar to the countries in Europe and Japan. Interestingly, Japan is a model country here. It's not just the European. Europeans obviously very important, but Japan is also an Asian model. Secondly, cabinet government should be established. The administration of the country should be in the hands of senior officials appointed by the king, and clear rules of royal succession should be put in place. Bribery should be abolished. Officials should be paid an adequate salary. People should be treated equally under the law. This is a big one. Customs or laws which are criticised by the Europeans as being backward and obstructing the progress of the country should be abolished. Freedom of thought and speech and freedom of the press should be allowed. Really modern idea. And a meritocratic system of educated officials, taking up positions in the royal bureaucracy should be established. So the principle of merit in the bureaucracy should be established. And interestingly, at the end you can see there's a real sort of nationalist vision for the kingdom. Just to quote it, the heart of this proposal is to reorganise the country along European lines so that the people feel that the oppression and injustice have ended, and so that they will love their country and realise that Siam belongs to them, that they must look after and care for it. So here, I think when we think of nationalism in Thailand, we always see maybe sort of dated from the sort of the latter part of the fifth reign, in particular the sixth reign of King Wacharawut. But even in the 1880s, it's coming from these princes. We see a sort of nationalist vision associated with Republican ideas. Okay, so King Chulalongkorn, he's not very happy with this petition, as you might have guessed, and so he writes back, and while he agrees that Siam needed reform, he rejected the central demand of the transformation of the country to a constitutional monarchy, and he argued that he was not an oppressive monarch like all those European ones, who had to go through revolutions and so on to limit their authority. He wasn't oppressive like them, but the problem in Siam was that we didn't have enough qualified officials. Okay, that was his problem. And of course, shortly after this, about in the 1890s, he carries out his big reforms that reorganise the kingdom into a much more, centralised, true sort of absolute monarchy. So the petition in the end came to nothing. The leading figure, Prince Britsadang, who is actually the subject of a very good book by Tamara Alus, he was demoted for his trouble and goes into exile, and he only returns to Siam after the death of King Chulalongkorn. He comes back in 1911. Okay, so there we have a sort of an elite aristocratic argument for some Republican oriented reforms. But so it's kind of coming from the top, but it's not just restricted right at the top. There are other people, and the famous one here is Tien Wan Wanapo. He was a commoner. Okay, this guy's a commoner, although he supposedly had descended from a noble family in Ayutthaya. His uncle, this is important. His uncle was the Supreme Patriarch, Tsar. So he had elite connections. He also had he was a worldly person. When he was young, he worked as a trader on a ship that plied the ports along the Chinese coast. Later on, he becomes a lawyer, and he becomes quite westernized, as a lot of people in Southeast Asia did at that time, kind of middle class people, this emerging middle class. So he dressed in Western clothes, and he kind of acted like a Western gentleman. And it was while working as a lawyer that, interestingly, nothing has changed much, has it? Working as a lawyer, he comes up, gets into trouble with the government, the royal government, and he's eventually imprisoned for 17 years, in fact, on a contempt charge. And when he's in prison, he's kind of writing a proposal to reform the Thai kingdom. And that's where he kind of develops this idea that Thailand needed a constitutional system. In 1898, he's released. A couple of years later, he starts publishing a journal, Dula Wipak Potanagit, with a print run of 1,000 copies. That's important, 1,000 people. It's quite a lot of people at that time. And in this journal, he's criticising, the evils of this time: corruption, poor education, gambling and other social problems, slavery, polygamy, the lack of freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and problems of government. He's always criticising, the greedy government officials and corruption and things like this. And he advocates a parliamentary system as a way of reforming Thailand's government. And his models, interestingly, are the United States and Japan. Okay, so now these criticisms are starting to move out of the elite and to the sort of the upper middle class, if you like. I think it's also important to bear in mind the international situation. So I think it's really coming from within Siamese society. That's the important thing. But it's sort of fitting in with the zeitgeist, if you like, internationally. This is a period which I've called an age of revolution, echoing my, or channeling my inner Eric Hobsbawm. So this is, monarchies are falling left, right, and centre. Japan defeats Russia in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, and that leads to a kind of the first revolution in Russia, and Russia becomes a constitutional monarchy. There's a revolution in Persia or Iran in 1906, and in the Ottoman Turks uprising in 1908, which really abolishes the absolute monarchy in the Ottoman Empire. The sultans hang on for a while, but the absolute monarchy of the Ottoman sultans is gone. Portugal, interestingly, because Portugal is the oldest colonial power in Southeast Asia, there's a revolution which overthrows the monarchy in 1910 in that country and transforms it into a republic. But the biggest event, of course, the daddy of them all, if you like, was the Chinese Revolution of 1911, which ends, what was it, 2,000 years of imperial rule. And this is important not just because of China's status in the region, but also because of Siam's large and growing Chinese community, which, if you add up the assimilated sort of Sino ties, this makes up perhaps even half of Bangkok's population. Sun Yat-sen, he travels to Bangkok quite regularly. He's trying to drum up support and funds for the Chinese Revolution. He's giving speeches. In fact, he gets kicked out of the country by King Chulalongkorn for advocating republicanism. Not in Thailand, but in China. So these you have Chinese people like Sun Yat-sen and others who are advocating republicanism within the Chinese community in Siam at this time. By the way, for those of you who want to read more about this, look at Wasana Wongsurawat's book, The Crown and the Capitalists, which is very interesting on this period, and also how the monarchy plays the game. They're very smart. Okay. Everyone's heard of 1932, the overthrow of the absolute monarchy in Thailand, but not so many people have heard about the 1912 conspiracy. And here, I think people have written about this, the Thai historians, and there aren't many of them, of course. But I think we have to really thank the work of Natapon Jai-jing. He's a really key figure, and he's really, I think, been the main historian who has brought this period kind of back to life, and has really influenced the way that we think about the sort of the pro-democracy movement from about the 1910s up until the 1950s, with a series of really excellent books, and including a book on the 1912 conspiracy, Kabot Roson and Samsun. So this happens. It's 1912. It happens just 2 years after the end of the reign of King Chulalongkorn, after he passes away. Thailand's great modernizing king. Just 2 years later, there's a conspiracy to do what? To overthrow the monarchy, to overthrow the absolute monarchy. A lot of reasons behind it. The armed forces had expanded rapidly. It's led by junior military officers, commoners. They're kind of disgruntled for lots of different reasons, but they also are gaining support from outside the military. One of the main problems was the commanding officers were almost always aristocrats, and the commoners felt that there was no promotion according to merit, and there was problems with corruption and so on. So there was resentment about this growing. There's a budget crisis in 1908. There's sort of cutbacks in recruitment and promotions and so on. There's always, I think, in these things, you need to be careful not to be too idealistic about it. Every successful revolution, there's always a lot of self-interest involved, and we shouldn't sort of shy away from that. Which doesn't mean to say that the ideals are wrong, but sometimes ideals without self-interest sometimes the objectives aren't always achieved. There's also a growing dissatisfaction with the new king, King Wachirawut. The conspirators were led by Captain Kun Tuihan Pitak, but who's better known as Morleng. He's a Thai of Chinese descent in the Army's medical division. And what he would do, he kind of give lectures. Nowadays they do it on social media, right? On Facebook or Clubhouse or something like that. Back then, he had lectures, and he would condemn in these lectures. He would condemn what he saw as the political problem of the absolute monarchy, including things like favoritism, the oppressive rule by the king, exploitation of the people, The king's, spending extravagantly. Nothing has changed very much, has it? There's strong appeals to national sentiment. So again, I like to kind of just draw out the connection here between republicanism and nationalism. When we think of nationalism, we always think of Chat, Sasana, Pramagasa, nation, religion, and king. That's the dominant conservative view of nationalism. But there is a sort of a republican nationalism as well, which, of course, Matthew Copeland talked about in that famous thesis that he wrote back in the 90s. So he appeals to national sentiments and kind of claims that the absolute monarchy is holding back the progress of the nation. And he, in these lectures, he also kind of talks about the different political systems around, so and their advantages and disadvantages. It's quite academic, actually. So he talks about, the advantages and disadvantages of absolute monarchy, what he calls limited monarchy, what we might call constitutional monarchy, and a republic. And he explained that countries in which the people had brought the monarchy under constitutional rule, or who had abolished the monarchy altogether, and countries like France or America, these countries had been able to achieve progress and become more civilized because the people were now free. The people were now free in these countries. Then he goes on, even in Asian countries like Japan, Turkey, and now China, they were following the same example. So the sense you get from his lectures is that this is an inevitable thing that's coming. If you want to kind of modernize your country, become free, become civilized, you can't continue with an absolute monarchy. He says only in Siam did this, and quote unquote, this barbaric system of rule continue. Just let me give a quote from one of his lectures about his definition of republic. A republic is a country in which the monarchy has been abolished. Instead, there's a committee to govern the country strongly. The head of the government of the country is the president. The people or citizens all become the same class. So he's not a Marxist. This is kind of before Marxism starts to get a hold. No one is allowed to be inferior or superior to anyone else, like in countries with other political systems, which divide the people up into different classes, making the feudal lords the highest class, then the nobility who are appointed by the king, then the commoner class, and below that, the lower class people who are slaves. Put simply, the king raises up his own people to become the highest level, like angels, and suppresses the people to become the lower class, like animals. Even those who are raised up to be nobility, actually they're just slaves of the king. This division of humanity into lower and upper classes means that people don't receive justice equally. Those in the higher classes are proud and arrogant and look down on the lower classes or oppress and exploit them at their pleasure. In a republic, these social divisions have been abolished. All the people are pushed into one class. Everyone possesses the same freedoms. There are no high class or low class people. For this reason, the people of all countries all want to change the form of government into a republic. So the whole world, they want to become republics now. At this time, almost all countries around the world, large and small, are republics. For example, the countries in the American continent, they're all republics. In Europe, France and Portugal, they're republics. France was the first to begin this form of government. Portugal just changed last year. At this moment in China, they are fighting fiercely to change the system of government to a republic. So, end quote. So the sense you get from Morleng is that the whole world, they're all going republic. They can see this system of absolute monarchy. They can see how problematic it is, and that's why they're changing to republics. Now, on a number of occasions, there was a vote held amongst the leading conspirators as to what they would do with Siam's monarchy. Some of them favoured a limited monarchy, constitutional monarchy really. The majority, though, are said to have voted for a republic. And there are some reports that claim that there was even a vote, ballots were drawn to decide who would kill the king. Now, it was the plot was hatched in the army in these sort of junior military officers, but it received support from outside, and it was said that the number of supporters were perhaps as many as 3,000 people. Some of these people, some of the military guys who are the leading conspirators, they come from as far away as the northern provinces, Chiang Mai and other ones. So it's not something that's just a small, clique in Bangkok. It's actually You have the supporters around the country. So anyway, the plot is foiled, but it grabs international attention at that time. It's a big thing. In the 6th of March issue of the New York Herald ran the headline, "Siam has caught Republic fever." Another New York newspaper, The Sun, it ran the headline, "Want Republic in Siam." Okay, so it's unsuccessful. The authorities find out about it. There's a crackdown. They arrest 300 people and sentence 100 or so to long terms of imprisonment, not capital punishment. They weren't executed, interestingly. And the number of people who ended up in jail was actually reduced in the end to 23. Okay, so what was the response of the king? Well, King Vajiralongkorn, he's kind of taken back. He's pretty shocked at what's happened so early in his reign. He gets on the front foot and starts attacking the ideas of his enemies. He's very critical of the ethnic Chinese. And he also talks about the situation in China, which is, according to him, it's chaotic because of these Republican ideas. He predicted that the problems caused by the Chinese in Siam, so he tries to paint this as a Chinese problem. And he actually, in a famous, notoriously racist essay, "The Jews of the East," he predicted that the problems faced by the Chinese in Siam could end up similar to the problems faced by Jews in Russia. He's also criticising those Thais who he claims are copying the habits of the Chinese or imitating the West in demanding political reforms along the lines of political systems in Western countries. So you can sort of see these arguments, we hear the same arguments today. These arguments are first really expressed during this early period, and they may remain pretty much the same. Of course, when Vajiralongkorn is famous for developing this central concept of Thai nationalism, nation, religion, king, Chat Sasana, Pramagasa. And it's really, when you think about it, it's really in response to the rise of republicanism in Thailand. So we hear a lot about Chat Sasana, Pramagasa. We don't hear so much about why they were so keen to promote this idea. It's really a reaction to the rise of republicanism. Okay, moving on quickly because we don't have so much time. So the popularity of republicanism amongst the educated elite in Siam, it grows, and we can judge that really by how easy it was in the end for the promoters who overthrow the absolute monarchy in 1932 and set up the People's Party. It's actually by comparative standards, it's a pretty easy coup. There's no bloodshed. It takes place pretty smoothly. We all know there's a rebellion the following year, which again, Natapon Jayading has written a great book about it, Gabot Boradeb. For those of you, it's a fantastic book. I really encourage you to read it. And the counter revolution led by Prince Boradeb, it's a shambles, and they crushed this counter revolution in the end quite easily. So that what that suggests is that the elite in Thailand, even actually the lower levels, some of the lower levels of the aristocracy, as well as this rising middle class, they know that the writing's on the wall, and they know that Siam has to change. The question really is whether it should be a republic or a constitutional monarchy. Now, here I can't resist reading out the famous Declaration of the People's Party number 1, which was believed to have been drafted by the French-trained lawyer in Bridi Panomyong, and was it's the first document of the People's Party after the coup. Just let me read out some parts of it, because you can kind of sense the anger against the regime, and also the strength of Republican feelings. So, quote, the King's government doesn't govern the country for the people as in other countries. The King's government treats the people like slaves or like animals. They're not treated like people as in other countries. The people, you need to know that the country belongs to you, not the king, as you've been deceived. The money that has been collected by the feudal lords should be used to develop the country and provide employment. but the feudal lords haven't done that. They will continue to suck your blood. Whatever money is left, they'll take out of the country. This is their wickedness. Now, on the question of the, I'll continue the quote. On the question of the head of state, the People's Party doesn't wish to seize the throne. They say that. It will invite this king, that is King Bachatipo, they will invite this king to continue in his office as king, but he must be placed under the law of the constitution governing the country. He will not be able to act of his own accord without receiving the approval of the House of Representatives. The People's Party has already informed the king of its wish. We await his reply. Basically, they sent him an ultimatum. If the king refuses this invitation or does not reply by the deadline, believing that his power has been reduced, selfishly believing his power has been reduced, then he will be judged to be a traitor to the nation. It will be necessary to govern the country as a republic. The word for republic is Bachatipatai, republic. That is, the head of the state will be a commoner appointed by the House of Representatives for a fixed term of office. Now, the 1932 revolution, change of government, whatever you call it, is kind of regarded, well, it is not kind of, it's regarded as the beginning of Thai democracy. But as I mentioned there, the word in the declaration, Bachatipatai, today that is translated as democracy, but back then, Bachatipatai meant republic. That is a state without a monarchy, without a hereditary monarchy. And in fact, as Nakarin Mekdarat, who no one would claim to be a Republican, he's actually on the Constitutional Court and is a very conservative guy, but he wrote a couple of good books early in his career. He pointed out that in the original draft of the declaration, the Thai word for Bachatipatai was actually followed by an English translation, just to be sure. Republic, Bachatipatai, Wonglep, republic. So it's not a political sleight of hand, that's what it meant. In official dictionaries from this period, the 1920s, 1930s, both the Thai to Thai dictionaries and Thai to English dictionaries, the common translation of the word Bachatipatai was republic. Before 1932, Bridi Panomyong himself, when he was teaching his law students, that there were two kinds of democracy, two kinds of Bachatipatai. That is, a country with a president as the head of the government, like France, or a country in which executive authority lay with a committee, like the Soviet Union. So both the examples that he gave, of Bachatipatai, of democracy, were republics. Okay, so the point I want to make here is how powerful Republican discourses were in the 1920s and 1930s, and that history has been hidden deliberately. Now, after the Bureaucrat rebellion, the king has to leave the country. He abdicates in 1935. The royal family basically flee to Switzerland. The People's Party appoint a regent. It's a big kind of debate about what to do, whether to go the whole way and declare a republic, but the kind of more conservative-minded people of the People's Party thought that was kind of going too far. Interestingly, and this is, you can read about this in Watsonar's book, The Crown and the Capitalist. There are the Kuomintang in China. They're in contact with the Nationalist Party in China. They're in contact with their Sino-Thai colleagues in Siam, and they're saying, "Come on, you haven't gone far enough. You've got to turn Thailand into a real republic." Why? Because they felt that a constitutional monarchy was still too close to Britain, to British Empire, and they wanted to Siam to become truly independent from the British, and they felt that the only way to do that was for Siam to become a true republic. It's kind of really interesting chapter that not many people know about. That is the Chinese connection in republicanism in Siam at this time, in Watsonar's book. Okay, so I'm moving along now. Again, I'd like to sort of mention here the work of Nattapon Jaiting, who's written a great book and articles on the royalist sort of counter-revolutionary attempts, which start up pretty soon after the 1932, and and actually are eventually successful in the late 1950s. But so all this time, there's this really kind of vicious internal kind of war going on, political war between the People's Party and the Royalists, who a lot of whom want to go back to the old absolute monarchy. So the fight goes on for a long time. Okay, but eventually the People's Party, for lots of reasons, complicated reasons, after the war, they're basically in disarray. Okay, and the Royalists, they make this remarkable comeback, and they're a bit lucky. And the Cold War really kind of turns it for them. In particular, the support that the Americans give for kind of restoring really the monarchy as a conservative symbol of stability, to kind of combat the rise of communism in Thailand. I kind of myself, I think, the Americans are important. There's no doubt about it. But I think sometimes we overlook the internal drivers of this conflict between the Royalists and more progressive-minded, I guess, social democrats, as well, of course, as the rising number of socialists. So I'll move now and talk about socialism, because from about the 1950s, discourses, the old sort of kind of more liberal, kind of French Revolution style, okay, that's not liberal, but the more the older discourse of republicanism sort of changes more to a Marxist-inspired discourse of republicanism. And you can sort of see this firstly in a very important book written by a leading kind of socialist thinker, Udom Sisa, called Thailand, a Semi-Colony, Gung Mung Kun. In which he develops this idea of this Maoist idea. It comes from Mao, of the semi-colonial, semi-feudal society. The semi-colonial, semi-feudal society. So the difference is, by the 1950s, decolonization is sweeping the world and Southeast Asia. So the colonial powers are not there anymore, but you have a kind of a semi-colonial situation where they're kind of, according to the Marxist or the Maoist theory, they're kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes, and in particular through their kind of proxies, if you like, the feudalists in the country. And of course, the feudalists. Who are the feudalists in Thailand? The feudalists, of course, is the monarchy and the remaining aristocracy. The aristocracy now is really in decline in numbers and in influence. So the idea of the semi-feudal, semi-colonial society is that the feudal rulers of Thailand, that is the monarchy, had to adapt to the new international situation. With the coming of imperialism and capitalism in the 19th century, King Chulalongkorn's great administrative reforms were basically a way in which the monarchy accommodated itself to a world of European imperialism. And in fact, these reforms enhanced the powers of the feudal class. But it was a feudal class which was dependent on foreign capital. Okay, so Thailand's now, in the 1950s, Thailand is now a semi-colonial, semi-feudal society, and this becomes the dogma for Marxists in Thailand, indeed the Communist Party of Thailand, really up until 1980. It's the frame of reference for the way that Thai society was analysed. The end of the book, at the end of Udom's book, there's a call to, and I quote, overthrow imperialist influence and wipe out the remnants of feudalism, i.e., overthrow, get rid of the monarchy, which implies the change to a republic. These ideas were taken further, of course, by probably Thailand's most famous Marxist intellectual, Thit Phumrisak. In particular, the work he's most famous for, The Real Face of Feudalism in Thailand Today, Chom Na Sak Na Thai Nei Pachuban, published in 1957, banned, republished in 1973, during this brief period of openness, banned again in 1976. The book is mostly historical. That book is kind of a historical critique of Thai history from a Marxist perspective. but in the introduction, you can see the Republican sentiments very clearly. He writes, Pumisak writes, and I quote, "The principal enemies that must be driven away with all urgency are the imperialists without and the Saklina within." Saklina, it's a Thai word meaning feudalism. So we've got to eliminate feudalism within. What does that mean? It's the monarchy. We've got to eliminate the monarchy. They appear again in a note in the 1957 edition of the book, where he explains, towards the end of the book, he explains that this work is still unfinished. We will come to the economic, political and cultural role of the Saklina today, and we end with the means by which the people will liberate themselves from the semi-Saklina, semi-colonial conditions. So liberate themselves from this situation, i.e. by getting rid of the monarchy. Okay, so there is this Marxist inspired critique of Marxist inspired republicanism, but framed by this powerful concept of the semi-colonial, semi-feudal society. Okay, so the real blow to Thai republicanism, I think, so I'm coming towards my conclusion now. I think my time is okay, I hope. Let me know if I'm going over time. The real blow comes with the collapse of the Communist Party of Thailand in the early 1980s, the end of the insurgency. After that, or even really before the collapse. And what the significance of all this is that it leaves Thailand without the Marxist critique of monarchy, which is always a bit, the CPT was always a little bit careful how they dealt with the monarchy, because they wanted to kind of win over the people, but they were careful not to alienate them. But nevertheless, with the collapse of the CPT, that's the end of the Marxist critique of the monarchy, more or less. And you don't really have a more liberal critique either, which had died with the People's Party. So for the first time, in really 80 years, you don't really have an active critique of the monarchy and an active sort of Republican discourse. As we know, in the 1980s, General Brem is Prime Minister. He's very close to the palace. This is kind of the heyday of King Bhumibol. It's when he really sort of comes into his own. The monarchy is extremely popular. As Somsak GMT Rasagun argues, you get this development of this mass monarchy concept, where the monarchy now becomes, you get this mass support, which has been created through the mass media and the education system. So as a result, Republican discourses are more or less extinguished during this period, from about 1980 to about 2005. Republican discourses are more or less extinguished. Okay, I'm coming to my conclusion now. So the seeds of republicanism in Thailand, after being, the plants were the jungle was out of control at one stage, but after 1980, the seeds of republicanism lay dormant for about 25 years. But as I hope I've shown in the paper, that Thailand was very fertile, was very fertile soil for Republican ideas. All you needed to do was to add water and fertilizer, and the shoots of republicanism would spring up again. And that's exactly what happened. Here, the water and fertilizer, who was it? It was Thaksin. Thaksin comes to power in 2001, and as we know, he's ousted in a coup, which is backed by the monarchy in September 2006. So this is why Thaksin is so significant, as Somsak has argued, that Thaksin kind of revives or creates the conditions by which the monarchy is now subject to criticism again for the first time in a long time. Now, let me quickly say, Thaksin himself is no Republican. I'm not saying he was a Republican, but he creates a condition because of his popularity. He creates conditions for the rise of Republican sentiments. He's seen as too popular. He's seen as competing with the king for the popularity of the country, and thereby as a threat to the monarchy. And with the monarchy's sometimes tacit, sometimes overt support, there's a campaign against him, culminating in the coup in 2006, then the abolishment of his political parties, when the king kind of basically really goes on television to tell the judges, the Constitutional Court, basically what to do, in not so many words. And then there's constant royalist attacks on Thaksin's political parties and their supporters, culminating in the massacre of red shirts in April, May 2010. So this is when we see the republicanism spring back, I would argue, as strong, if not stronger than ever before. The military coup of 2014, the accession to the throne of the new king, Vajiralongkorn, who is widely loathed, really. His consolidation of his personal authority and his really appalling behaviour, I think you could call it what it is, it's just disgraceful. At a time of widespread economic hardship, this has helped fan the flames of republicanism. So the question is, how widespread are these ideas today? The difficulty in answering this question, obviously, it's impossible to do a poll on republicanism, right? Because that's of course against the law. No one can do that. So you just got to look at circumstantial evidence. Republicanism in Thailand, to paraphrase someone, it's the crime that dare not speak its name. It's the crime that dare not speak its name. Everyone avoids mentioning it, but it's there. It's kind of like, I don't like that cliche, the elephant in the room, but it's there. It's been there for 120 years, 140 years. The very fact that even mention of republicanism is so, it's people are so wary to use it, just shows you how potentially powerful the concept is. This is a problem. It's not only an obvious problem within Thailand, it's also a problem outside. There are lots of academics for lots of reasons. I'm not saying that they're not good reasons. Even outside, a lot of people, academics and reporters, have been wary to be too explicitly critical of the monarchy. I think that is changing now, particularly under this new king. But in the past, the monarchy always kind of gets off pretty lightly, especially by comparison to criticism of Thaksin and his supporters. So if we can't take a poll on republicanism, we've got to look at other indicators. What other indicators are there? Well, firstly, obviously the popularity of Thaksin. He wins election after election after election, until the 2014 coup. Even after the Democrats in one election, the Democrats campaign overtly. They're saying that Thaksin's going to overthrow the monarchy. You can't vote for him. He's going to overthrow the monarchy. What happens? Thaksin emerges as the biggest party. He gets the most votes. Okay, so obviously people might not have believed the Democrats' rhetoric, or they might have felt, well, do I really care? Secondly, the widespread use of the lèse majesty law. It's just, as everyone knows, it's really been ramped up in the last, really since 2005. They're using it all the time. Why? Because there's so much now criticism of the monarchy. The hunting down and exile of critics of the monarchy. I think Bowen made an interesting point the other day on Clubhouse that there are more anti-monarchy dissidents in exile overseas than ever before. Yes, there have been some in the past, but now there's so many because they've been forced out of the country. You can kind of look at the enactment of the Computer Crimes Act. I think it was in 2007. Computer Crimes Act, basically the number one crime they're cracking down on is criticism of the monarchy. Okay, in the social media, as everyone knows, there are all these Facebook sites and indeed with Twitter now, critical of the monarchy. I guess the famous one is Bowen Chachawanpongpan's Royalist Marketplace. He sets it up within a couple of weeks. I think he's got 2 million followers. 2 million just overnight. Yes, not all of them are in Thailand, but a lot of them are. The sudden popularity of the Future Forward Party, before the election last year, which was seen, it doesn't have an overtly Republican agenda, but implicitly it's expressing some of the ideas that sort of that first broader definition of republicanism, of limiting the powers of the monarchy that I talked about, came out of nowhere in 2019. And became the second largest party in the parliament after the election. Of course, then they cracked down on it. They banned the party. They've moved over to this new Galklai party. So it's very popular amongst young people. That's a real danger sign for the royalists, because future forward is very popular amongst the young, which shows that they're attracted to these ideas. And of course, I can't stop but finish on the support right around the country for the student protests. It's incredible student protests which broke out in August last year. And it's not just university students, it's high school students. It's incredible. There was one sort of video I saw from one school. I think it was in Suratani, and one girl I think she was in year 10. She was basically asking about the king's involvement, or the monarchy's involvement, in the 6th of October 1976 massacre. And the teacher, obviously, she didn't know really how to reply to this one. So you're getting, there's a kind of real sort of civil disobedience now in the schools, as well as the universities, against this kind of top-down royalist indoctrination, which kind of comes out of the Cold War. It doesn't make any sense anymore. People are rebelling against it. There's a lot of interest in the history, especially the history of 1932 and 6th of October 1976. Not so much Sipsitulan. 1973, people aren't interested in that anymore. They're interested in 1976 and 1932. These are the controversial periods where the monarchy is involved. And history books now are selling like hotcakes. History is a really big seller now in Thailand. And sometimes at these rallies, people will pick up a book, one of Natapon's book, or one of Tongchai's books, which are seen as as kind of icons now, because they seem to be symbolic of this criticism of the monarchy. But what is unprecedented about these protests is that they are publicly calling for a reform of the monarchy. It's never happened before. Mass, widespread protests where they're actually directly criticising the monarchy and calling for its reform. And here, if I can share my screen, I'll just show you the 10 demands. Correct, wrong, sip, call. Sorry, let me get the right one up. Here we are. I hope you can see those. The font is a bit small, but I wanted to get them all on one page. Look at these 10 demands. They're all about the monarchy. They're all about reforming the monarchy. Look at number 10. The king must not endorse any further coup. So this is an outright attack, the way I see it, on the monarchy. And of course, people have to frame this carefully, because they don't want to run foul of the law, but of course they already are. I think, as an academic looking at this and thinking about the history of republicanism, this is coming out of this Republican tradition. So if you look at the campaign to abolish the lèse-majesty law, okay, the campaign, it's a big one. I think this goes even further than the 10 demands. The campaign, because to my mind, it's hard to think how the Thai monarchy could survive without the protection of the lèse-majesty law. That is the law which forbids any criticism of the king, queen, the heir, and the regent. I can't see how the monarchy can survive unless you have that law. You either have the lèse-majesty law and you keep the monarchy, and you will not be able to reform it with the legislation. You just cannot reform it. They won't let you. But if you take away the lèse-majesty law, I can't see how the monarchy can survive, because all of the skeletons in the closet would be open. People would, and the monarchy has lots of enemies. People shouldn't forget they have lots and lots of enemies on all different sides. So I think that's a situation we're in right now. We're seeing the sort of the revival of this Republican tradition, and right now I think I'm reminded of the Gramscian, that famous Gramscian phrase, the war of position and the war of movement. War of position and war of movement. So I think we're in a war of position right now. It's like a battle of hegemony, and the protesters and lots of other groups, they're trying to bring down the hegemony of the king. In all the propaganda, all the rest of the stuff. They don't have the political support to move into a war of movement phase, but that may be on the cards at some stage in the future. So what I've tried to do today is to kind of show to you this long history of Republican thinking in Thailand, It's been hidden for a long time, especially during the latter part of the reign of King Bhumibol, who was there for 70 years, and especially the second half of his reign, he reigns supreme. He's the most powerful political figure in the country. That kind of suppresses this Republican tradition. But since particularly the rise of the Thaksin governments and the royalist pushback against democratic elections, this Republican tradition now has re-emerged, I think, as strong as it ever has been. So with that, thanks for listening, and I'll be pleased to address any questions you might have.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Jory, for your extremely thoughtful discussion of Thai republicanism. Let me quickly introduce Professor Lisandro Claudio, our discussant. Professor Claudio is an assistant professor of Filipino intellectual and cultural history in South and Southeast Asian studies at UC Berkeley. Professor Claudio, please proceed with your responses.
Thank you, Thiti, and thank you, Patrick, Professor Jory. I mean, this is obviously a very relevant talk amid pro-democratic protests everywhere and in Southeast Asia in particular, and amid a new Republican vogue led by, of course, the leading global Republican, Meghan Markle. Just kidding. I want to say two things about why I think this is an important talk, and I'll be very brief. The first is, I think it represents a moment in Southeast Asian studies where we are reconceptualizing what oppositional politics in Southeast Asia has looked like and what it can look like. So Professor Jory mentioned that he talks about the hidden history of republicanism. And in particular, as someone who studies liberalism, I'm interested in the hidden history of liberal republicanism, the first part that he talked about. And I must say that the history of liberalism in Southeast Asia has not just been hidden by autocrats, by kings, monarchs, religious people, etc. It's also been kind of buried by Cold War scholarship, which created stereotypes about Southeast Asian resistance as either Marxist internationalist, or purely millenarian or religious. And I think the kind of work that Professor Jory presents us allows us to think about these other forms of resistance or other forms of oppositional and collective politics in Southeast Asia. And I think he's absolutely correct to reference as well the work of somebody like our colleague Peter Zinnemann, who's thinking along these lines as well. And of course, there are many other figures in this respect. And Anthony Miller, for example, who has been thinking about Malaysian liberalism. You can even think about somebody as foundational as George Cahan, who I argue actually is thinking about a kind of unarticulated but nevertheless powerful Indonesian liberalism. And then secondly, I think the important thing about this work is that it shows us that republicanism/liberalism is what may rescue nationalisms in Southeast Asia. So Professor Jory mentioned that Southeast Asian scholars don't want to give up on the idea of nationalism. I think that's something that that he mentioned in the paper version of the talk. And I think if we don't want to give up on nationalism, at the very least, we should look for language that allows us to reconceptualize it alongside Southeast Asia. And Professor Jory obviously foregrounds a notion of a Republican nationalism. I might add a liberal Republican nationalism. And I think it's important. That's an important locus of politics, and that's an important alternative. So you can think of that as an alternative to, say, racist nationalism in Malaysia, royalist nationalism in Thailand, communist nationalism in Vietnam, or even Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar. And it opens up these possibilities of collective action and collective thinking that does not fall prey to these exclusive nationalisms and exclusionary rather nationalisms that we've seen in Southeast Asia. So that's all I have to say. I just want to thank Professor Jory for that wonderful talk and for connecting it to the present. So thank you very much. And I look forward to the questions that people have and how Professor Jory will address those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisandro.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Claudio. Then before we get to the Q&A, Professor Jory wishes to reply to some of Professor Claudio's comments. Please feel free to do so.
Yeah, look, I think I've talked a lot. I think they're very apposite comments. And I think, yeah, particularly the point about how Cold War scholarship has has played a part in kind of, I guess, suppressing or hiding or obstructing these early discourses. I think that's a great point to make. I absolutely agree with that. And the Cold War casts a long shadow, but maybe now we're only now just sort of moving out of that shadow.
Right, thank you for your answers. Then we have already a few questions in the Q&A box. So let me remind all the attendees that you please feel free to post your question or comments in the separate Q&A box. And if possible, please specify your current affiliation in your question and comment. So the first question comes from Peter Zinnerman, and the question goes this way. 19th century European republicanisms often target two big enemies, the monarchy and the church. Your account of Thai republicanism emphasizes the first, the monarchy, but has little to say about the second, the church. Can you speak about the role of religion in Thai republican thought?
That's a fantastic question, and the reason why it's so fantastic is it's hard to answer. But I have been thinking more about this because I haven't dealt with it really at all, not very well at all. The Royalists tended to have a very kind of conservative view of religion, but you never find the, I guess, Republican-minded activists attacking religion. And in fact, Breedy himself, he was quite religious in the end. And I think he wrote a book, didn't he, on socialism and Buddhism. And even at the end of the Kamprakat Kanarasadan Jabapinung, that declaration, he talks about the objective is to kind of create a world of prasian. Prasian, this is a concept from millenarian Buddhism. It's kind of like a future world it's the world of the future Buddha. And that's what the People's Party are going to try and create. So you don't have the critique of the religious establishment that you do have in European republicanism. You often find that the Royalists tend to use religion to naturalise the monarchy as a legitimate form of government, and they go back to the famous Aganya Sut in the Buddhist scriptures, where you have the first monarch, who's actually in the Thai tradition of that discourse is a bodhisattva, and he is supposedly elected by the people, Mahasamata. So the people like Prince Thani, he makes an argument that in fact Buddhism supports monarchical rule, and monarchical, the Thai monarchical rule, Buddhist monarchical rule already has the support of the people. But even so, you just do not have the critique of the Buddhist establishment that you do in European republicanism. And I guess I don't really have a great answer for that yet, Peter, but I'm working on it.
All right, almost like a qualifying exam question. So then next question comes from Pong Kwan Sawattipak from University of Southern California and ATD. There are two questions, so I will read out both of them at the same time. First, why do you think many Thai former communist sympathizers have turned to support the monarchy despite the contradiction to the ideology? I think she refers to something more recent. And second question, how can we advocate for republicanism in Thailand more effectively with the lèse majesté law and the Computer Crime Act in place? How can the international academic community help advance the cause?
It's a good question about why so many ex-communists. I mean, not all of them. You got people like Jataron who is still, not a communist, but he, everyone knows he's not a big fan of the monarchy. But yeah, you're right. A lot of the ex people on the left have defected. Can we use that word? To the royalist side. I think the Thaksin era politicised everyone, and I think partly it's that idea, that old leftist idea that the monarchy. Well, in Thailand, the monarchy was like a paper tiger, and the big problem was imperialism and capitalism, and that should be the target. And so Thaksin, of course, was Tun Saman, this vulgar capitalism, and they felt that he was a much bigger threat to their interests than the monarchy was. I think they felt that the monarchy they could kind of use it for much more efficiently than Thaksin was just out of control from their point of view. So I think it was a kind of a pragmatic decision that the real enemy is Thaksin, and after that we'll I think even Sonti Limtongon, he's not a big fan of the monarchy actually, but he knows how to use it. He knows how to use it for his agenda, and that's politics. So I just think that they found Thaksin and the whole sort of globalization of the Thai economy under Thaksin, that was a real threat. So that was why they, in a war, in a political war, you got to choose sides. So they chose their side. On the second question, look, I'm not everyone knows I'm not a political activist. I'm not smart in that way. I'm not good at thinking about strategy or tactics or that kind of thing. I'm just an academic, and so I try and stick to my strengths if I have any. So I'm a little bit reluctant to kind of give any people advice about what they should do. But what I would say as an academic is, there's fantastic now, academic work coming out of Thailand. In Thai, I always say, I think, the best scholarship in history now, well, for a long time really in Thailand is coming out, it's in the Thai language. And, I think perhaps even sort of political science too sometimes. So there's a great stuff coming out. Read it, get your friends to read it. I think, like I said, I'm a bit of a Gramscian guy here. I think, we attack the hegemony. And how you attack the hegemony for an academic? Well, you teach, you write, and you disseminate your ideas as widely as possible. And I know lèse majesty and Computer Crimes Act makes it hard, but, find ways around it. People do. Don't get into trouble. I think, I'm not someone who is going to call on anyone to, get themselves into jail. Absolutely not. It's not worth it. It's not worth it. I'm not saying those guys were fighting. I have absolute admiration for them. But I think particularly academic, me sitting here, look where I am, in Brisbane, I'm not going to tell anyone to kind of protest against the monarchy and go to jail. I'd hate for that to happen. But as an academic, I'd say, just read these great works, disseminate them, write your own stuff, disseminate them as widely as possible, and break down this royalist hegemony that was sort of built up in its Cold War period that Lisandro was talking about.
All right. Next questions come from Andrew Johnson, a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley. Thank you so much for the talk. I would like to ask you to address the reactionary movements. Do you think recent moves by the current monarch in, say, centralizing military and finances under his personal control, amassing land in Dusit, etc., are these a kind of a new framing of absolute monarchy? Does this feed into a kind of global authoritarian movement, or are they less coherent and more personal?
That's an interesting question, because you do see in some places things which seem similar. I'm a little bit, personally, I'm not really a big fan of the revival of the absolute monarchy. I don't think kind of history goes backwards like that. But I'm not a sort of end of history guy either. That history is this kind of this teleology to liberal democracy. But I think there is a large degree of personal choice in that. Everyone knows Vajiralongkorn. He is highly impetuous. He wants to have things his own way. He's always been like that. We all know that King Bhumibol. I think you have to understand that he grew up in the period where these Republican ideas were very powerful. During the People's Party era, they were in exile for years. A very dangerous period, and he was always quite cautious political actor, I think, until really the end of his career. So, but Vajiralongkorn grew up really, in the 70s, particularly after 76. So he's had it pretty good. He's had it when the monarchy has had a lot of influence, a lot of control. He's grown up in the military where everyone's used to kind of doing what they're told. And he's used to getting what he wants. So, and the military will give it to him. So I think there's a high degree of the personal element, Vajiralongkorn himself. And I think a lot of it is also, they're well aware. I think that the royalists are very well aware of their enemies around them. So I think this is partly defensive. They know that there are a lot of people who really will want to at best transform Thailand into a regular constitutional monarchy, like Japan, like that's the best case scenario. But I actually think a lot of them, they're sick of it. They just want to get rid of it altogether. But no one can say that, obviously, because it's, you can't say that. But just look at him every other week. He's appointing one of his harem as a colonel or a general, and they're being now funded by the taxpayer. His harem. They're just absolutely brazen what he's doing. Living in Germany for all those years, living the high life. So he's complete. It's complete tin ear. No one will say no to him. And I think this is this is a real challenge for the people who want political reform, because in the past, I think that they tried to be quite careful. Like Thai people would say nian in the way that they dealt with the anti-monarchy people. But now it's in your face. It's in your face. They'll just stick you in jail. They'll throw away the key. They'll sentence you to 150 years jail. Fine, they don't care, because they're just so confident that they control the thing. So I think, again, I'm not a strategist, but if you want to kind of rein in the monarchy, you've got to kind of think about that, because it is so concentrated in the person of Vajiralongkorn. And I don't actually think that's, in the long run, very good for the monarchy itself. I think it's actually highly, highly dangerous. So that's a long answer to your question. I think, so there's both a kind of, I guess, a broader movement perhaps, but I think you don't want to overemphasize that. I think a lot of it is personal.
We have 2 more questions and we still have 15 more minutes. So just want to remind the attendees once again, if you have any questions, comments, or you want to come back from Professor Jory's replies to your question, please feel free to write them in the Q&A box. The next question comes from Nat Hong Dilokgun from British Columbia's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. The comments go as the following. If I understand correctly, you mentioned that republicanism can't be discussed in the public domain for 20-ish years before Thaksin came into power. The question is, do you think to some degrees this explains why Generation X is apparently the most royalist generation?
Yeah, look, that's a really good point. It's an excellent point. I think this is generational, and you can sort of see this. The clearest example is with I don't know, what do you call the generation that's school and university now? I can't even remember now. But those guys, they didn't didn't live through this propaganda, or at least maybe they lived through the tail end of it. And now you're getting, even King Bhumibol, towards the end of his career, he was in hospital a lot. So for the last, really since the last sort of 15 years, 15 to 20 years, I think that royalist propaganda has become much less effective, and that's why this younger generation, they are so radical. So it's a really good point. It's a really good point, and I think it's a real danger sign for the royalists, because that's this generation, and the coming generation, you would imagine, you just can't see them resurrecting the old propaganda apparatus that they had during the Bhumibol era. It's just impossible. They might think up something else, but I would think it's just in a modern place like Thailand, where a very globalized place, that you don't have that same hegemonic apparatus that you did back then. And yes, that's why the older generation tend to be much more royalist. So over time, you would imagine that older generation, they're going to die off. And the younger generation are going to become politically much more influential. That's another big danger sign, I think, for the way that the monarchy is handling itself right now.
Last question I got here, and we still have a few more minutes, so more questions is welcome. The question comes from Joe Garrett, and the question is, how would King Bhumibol have handled what's going on were he still alive? If he was still alive. So
again, as a historian, I that kind of question, it's it's difficult to answer, but let's talk about how he handled things in his own era. And as I said, I think he was a very careful political actor. He had a lot of experience. He built it up over time. I think a few years ago, I think Macago's concept of network monarchy at that time, I think it made sense. He had a lot of people sort of scattered around in different institutions. Yes, the military, but you have these sort of public intellectual types. You have people like Moderator and Kun Anand and all these people who are kind of as Connors would say, these kind of liberal conservatives. So it was a royalism which was kind of a pudi royalism, which is very effective, and so he was a completely different generation, a different era, and a completely different personality to Vajiralongkorn. So, but even towards the end of King Bhumipohn's era, I think the Thaksin challenge was so great that it kind of forced him to come out much more than I think he probably would have been comfortable with. So, basically kind of declaring, kind of persuading really, the judges to nullify elections, and then to, again, sort of come out publicly and kind of, persuade judges to abolish the Thai Rak Thai party. That kind of really politicised the monarchy. By that time, I think King Bhumipohn also, I don't think he probably wanted to do it that way, but there was no other choice. They had to do it because Thaksin was such a threat. So I think just the way that the whole, Thailand has developed over the last 20, 30 years, monarchies, they don't last forever anywhere, right? There's a kind of a logic about it that they just don't make sense anymore. And they'll fight to the end. They will fight to the end. There's not going to be, I can't see any reform. They just won't agree to it. You've got to force the reform. So maybe King Bhumipohn might not have done things all that much differently. He might have had a few more advisors than the current guy. But in the end, he's still the king. Kings basically, there's a sort of a realpolitik that they all use, I think.
We have two more questions. The first is from John Clark, and the question is, what would be the role of the military in any transition to a republic?
John, what are you talking about, transition to a republic? I didn't say that. Firstly, these are interesting questions and I can talk about them, but I'm a historian. I can tell you about the history, but I can't really tell you, more than the next person what's going to happen in the future. But since you asked the question, look, I think the key institution in any change will be the military. I don't think the street kind of protests are important in terms of demonstrating popular support for these changes, but anything that happened, I think, will be in the military. So, I don't actually necessarily think, we know that, for a long time, the monarchy has been very careful to control the key positions in the military, and Vajiralongkorn too. He's very smart like that. But it's not like everyone in the military likes Vajiralongkorn, believe me. I think he has enemies in the military. I think, one possible scenario is like Indonesia, 1997, 98. You have a kind of a Wiranto type figure. And Wiranto, he's not a Democrat, right? You get someone who is, a really patriotic guy, a patriotic general, who sees that, the country it's a disaster right now. It's a disaster. It's something has to change, and they will have to, there's a possibility, there's a kind of like an internal coup. They perhaps, round up all of Vajiralongkorn's operators, and I think they would fight. I think it'd be quite bloody. But I think that's one scenario where you have a kind of guy who's going to sacrifice himself for the nation. And don't forget, the military, they're extremely nationalistic. Now, the military, as those examples that I gave in the past, they're the ones who've kind of, 1912 and 1932, and in fact in 1957, all the coups, right? They come out because they feel themselves that they have to protect the nation. And if the nation is going down the drain because of this guy, I think there's a scenario where someone might step in, but these things are extremely risky. There'd be a sort of an internal sort of military conflict, and who knows what the outcome is. But it's one scenario, I would think.
we also have one more question. So that would be, these two questions are going to be last questions because we are running out of time. Then the question comes from Vanessa Hierman, your colleague. The question is, do you get a sense of the feeling for republicanism in southern Thailand, past and present?
Hi, Vanessa. Thanks for the question. Having spent a lot of time in southern Thailand, my answer is no. No, look, for lots of reasons which Thai people know, southern Thailand is the most royalist part of Thailand for interesting reasons. Which is not to say there aren't people down there who may not be sort of Republican-minded, but who may be Republican-minded. But generally speaking, the South is very royalist, and I would say they would be the last to move. But then again, you know, as we know, the Northeast and the North, they tend to be, you know, much more kind of open-minded on these kinds of things. So yeah, the short answer is no. I wouldn't expect any kind of strong support for the Republican movement. I'm not saying there is a Republican movement, like a kind of like a, you know, a sort of some kind of organic network, but I think a lot of people are kind of, you know, I think you can see it on social media. People are kind of thinking along these lines, even if there's no coordinating organisation that I know of. But yeah, the last guys I think who would lend their support to it would be people in the South, and I can say that from personal experience.
Now the last question comes from Eric White from University of Michigan. The question goes as follows. The visual, symbolic, and material culture dimensions of Republican anti-monarchic discourse conveyed through popular culture is very rich in the current moment. To what degree was this a prominent element of prior moments in Republican discourse in the Thai past?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's a really interesting question. And one, I guess I'd say, I'll give the academic answer that I haven't done a great deal of research in this area, but one thing I do know is that, you know, the whole concept of a constitution, a lot of people just didn't know what a constitution was. Yeah, okay, these, you know, Western educated guys did, but, you know, the country didn't. So there has been work looking at, you know, how the People's Party explained what a constitution was, and we know, you know, there is a all the monuments. I think, you know, Natapon Jaiding has written about this. You know, the creation of the democracy monument, for example, and, you know, that's the central element with the democracy, with the constitution. So yeah, there has been this kind of thing earlier, but, you know, the People's Party era, it was so brief. You know, it's only, well, let's say 32 to about, you know, 47 at best, 15 years, and they did a lot during that period. But in terms of, you know, transforming the Thai visual landscape, if you like, into one which is more Republican friendly, can we say? I just don't think they were around long enough. And it's interesting, you know, actually, now you mentioned it, how even despite the little that they did, that you know, Vajiralongkorn and the Royalists are trying to dismantle it, you know, so they take away that famous plaque, you know, in the Equestrian Plaza there. You know, they've renamed some barracks room, the Bawaradit, you know, room, to kind of commemorate the Prince Bawaradit, that failed counter-revolution. They've moved some of those constitutional monuments. Even at one stage there was some talk, and actually they were going to abolish, you know, I think it was in the 1960s, wasn't it? Abolish the democracy monument, but that never actually happened. So that they're aware of this visual landscape, but I just, yeah, I guess I'd say that it's not really, you know, it's just drowned by all the royalist imagery that you see. So yeah, I'd say they do draw on some of this earlier stuff, but yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Okay, unless Sarah has anything else to say, or Patrick has any last words, I would say thank you, Professor Jory, for thought-provoking discussion and really the replies to all the challenging questions. So let's see if Sarah or Professor Jory has any last words.
Yes, would you like to have make some closing remarks? Otherwise, we can conclude the day and let you get on with your day.
Yeah. I think I've already given a lot of remarks. So, but thanks everyone for listening in. I really appreciate it. It's always, for us, it's great to have an audience to talk to. So thanks for coming along.